trees, and you might notice that the trees, the forests are planted. Okay, as you go along, you can see at certain points, you look at them and see lines of trees, and you see the edges of the forest are normally straight, because these forests have all been planted. And there have been a heck of a lot of forests planted in this part of Scotland in particular, the southern uplands, in the last 80 years, really, since the end of World War II it started. Most of the trees are conifers, which come to maturity after 50, 60 years. Well, what I'm trying to say is that now Scotland has a timber industry. These days, and I've been coming as a tour director for nearly 20 years now to Scotland. 20 years ago, I didn't see many timber lorries, lorries carrying big tree trunks at all. But these days you do, because many of these forests are coming to maturity. And then they plant new forests. Scotland now has itself a timber industry. Look here left, everybody, okay? Those little, on the left-hand side there, down there, those green tubes you saw, those were saplings which will have been planted. More coming up here on the left-hand side. Okay?
Oh yes.
Saplings that have been planted. The green tubes are there to protect them against the elements and against rabbits, because rabbits like saplings. So, and when they grow a little bit more, then they will, I guess they're going to be replanting these saplings here somewhere, and there'll be a new forest coming. So, Scotland now has itself a timber industry. Did you know that Scotland also now has an increasingly important fish industry? Salmon. It is now a £1 billion industry for a small country like Scotland. A billion pounds is a lot of money, and getting bigger the whole time. Salmon, seafood. If you buy salmon in any shop in Europe and see where it's from, it will invariably say from Norway or from Scotland. Those are the two salmon countries in Europe. Right hand side, what's been happening there? Well, I think they've just cut down that little forest there.
That's two.
Okay. Sheep. Well, it's all a bit too hilly to grow any crops with ease around here, so what do? Animal husbandry, sheep. We do sheep in Britain, we do cows, we don't do goats. I've never seen a goat farm in Britain. Maybe it'll come, but I've never seen one. No, we do sheep, we do cows, well, we do pigs, of course, chickens. The sheep, well, if you go back to the Middle Ages, Britain had the best wool in the world, the known world, Europe, right, Northern Europe. It was a massive industry right through the Middle Ages. In fact, I would go so far as to say that probably the wool trade was the biggest single component in the economy of not only England but Scotland also, right through the Middle Ages. Those times have long since gone. If you see sheep these days, they will be invariably produced primarily for the meat.
entered, if you like, a medieval hall.
Yes.
This is a stage setting. He had this in his head, along with his friend Daniel Terry, who worked in the theatre. So together they knew exactly what they were going to do, and they did a sort of medieval stage setting. You have beautiful woodwork here, the paneling on the walls here. Now this is recycled. This came from an old church that was being demolished and built from there. And you can see that he's used it. The big plaques on the top of the doors, these possibly came from houses of Riva families. If they weren't fighting similar families on the English side, then they were fighting amongst themselves. It was a way of life in this part of the world until the king said, enough is enough. And James VI came up and said, that's it, finished. Now they live relatively peacefully, apart from the rumbling. Down the centre, we have coats of arms of Scots family. When he became Sir Walter Scott, he became a member of the nobility. And to be a true noble, you have to be able to find 16 coats of arms in your family. If you look at that side, there are 8 on the father's side, but on his mother's side, there are in fact only 5 and 3 others that he's invented. He does? A writer of fiction. But also there's a bit of Latin on it, as there was outside. A bit of Latin always impresses, and it says alta nox premit, which means all night pressing in on me. In other words, I can't get any further back to find any more. But he's got his 16 coats of arms. The coats of arms on the windows, on the top here, these are the various Scott families. I said outside, this Duke of Buccleuch is the head of all the Scott families. This is the one I want you to remember, the one with the 2 mermaids. This is Scott of Harden. And this is Scott's main family, the Scots of Harden. I'll be asking you about that later on. Scots of Harden. H-A-R-D-E-N. Harden. Right? All the others are just painted. The glass is painted. And it was painted by the wife of Daniel Terry, who, along with Scott, designed this room. Okay. The statue in the middle, statue of St Andrew, patron saint of Scotland. Again, copy of a statue from Melrose Abbey. The original is now in Edinburgh. Right? So you won't see many statues on the Abbey in Melrose. There are 1 or 2, but not these. So that's St Andrew. Now if we turn the other way, we'll see 2 more statues. St Peter on the left with the keys of heaven in his hand, and St Paul on the right. Right, the old woman hater. Okay, here we go then. Beside the 2 saints, there are 2 cuirass. These are souvenirs from his visit to the battlefield of Waterloo. Okay. Right? In 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo, Scott was to be introduced to the Duke of Wellington. He had been interested in Napoleon and was in fact writing a life of Napoleon. He was kind of fascinated by Napoleon but didn't admire him, but was fascinated. Anyway, he went to the battlefield, and these are souvenirs of the visit there. So this is his study. This was the last room to be added to the renovations. Where we were just now, in the entrance hall, that's where the old farmhouse would have been, right, that he bought. Right. He built on the back, and he built at the side, and then and this was the last. So I'd like to say, notice that he had gas lighting. See the little tap here? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Right, there would be gas lighting. It would be the only house in this part of the world that had gas lighting. I would imagine in Edinburgh they would start to have it. He had a place out at the back, an installation out at the back where they would make gas from whale oil. Right, from whale. So it would be pretty smelly. Yeah. So, but it was, nevertheless, it was the future. So there we go. So that's it. The room here, these books are mainly reference books he would refer to in his writings. There are about 2,500 up here, and they're quite interesting. They're in French, they're in German, they're in English, they're in Latin and Greek. They're quite a lot. He knew quite a bit in language-wise. He wasn't brilliant at German and Italian, but French he was quite competent in. After all, his wife, as we will find out, was French. So there we are. I like to say it was in here he wrote his later novels. Just a wee bit more about his life. In 1826 there was a recession. And the recession was damaging to Scotland, terribly damaging. He had, with 2 friends, a publishing house, hence the statue outside, and a printing works. And they suffered greatly. The debts, because Scott was really the main person in it, main putting of the money in, all the debts came to him. Now remember to look on the backs of the books to see the portfolios and a bit of Latin. The ceiling again is the same. This is the library anyway, obviously. This is the library. I say the obvious. Scott's favourite room. They would have parties in here. They would have dances in here. This is his favourite room. There are about 7,000 books in here. So along with the 2,500, there's a library of about 9,500 books. It is probably the best example of a Scottish author's library as it was when he died. Everything you've seen so far is basically as it was when he died. Now, obviously one or two things must be different because the family lived here. The ceiling again looks impressive. Have you been to Edinburgh Council?
Yes.
Yes, and you've seen the wooden ceilings there, beautiful wooden ceiling. Well, this is plaster. It looks like it, but it's imitating that. Holding the ceiling up round there, these are copies from Melrose Abbey. The ones hanging from the ceiling are copies from the Rosslyn Chapel. Now, I don't know whether you've been to the Rosslyn Chapel, but if you've read the Da Vinci Code, you will know that the story ends in the Rosslyn Chapel. Right? It is an amazing place. Every wall is carved, and the drop that you see there is called the Rosslyn Drop. It's a copy again. In this little corner here, you may have noticed on your way down there is a witch corner now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, Scott was very much into this witchcraft and sorcery and demonology, and this part of his library is where all his books are about it. But hidden in there is a thin little book, and it says 10 pieces of advice for newly married couples, 1648.
In the witchcraft part?
It's in the witchcraft. I think it's hidden away, actually. Anyway, let's have a look at the library. So we've got all these books, but you've also a portrait of his son Walter. This is son Walter.
Okay.
Right? So I'll call him young Walter. And it's thanks to young Walter that Scott didn't have to sell Abbotsford in the recession. I'm sure you were all asking, I wonder why he didn't have to sell Abbotsford in the recession. Well, the reason is young Walter had got married 2 years before, and the family of the girl he married said, you must make over the house to Walter as part of the agreement. So that was very fortunate. That the house actually didn't belong to son Walter at the time of the recession, but to young Walter. He was very proud of young Walter because he's a soldier, and Scott would have loved to have been a soldier, like his brothers in the military. But because of the polio, he was unable to be. That was why he had to study to be a lawyer and didn't do him any harm being a lawyer, ending up down here. Anyway, so that's young Walter there and the house. The books were bought by the Society of Advocates in Edinburgh. Scott being an advocate, the Society bought the books and they stay here. They still belong to the Society of Advocates. And if anybody wants to borrow a book or look at a book, they have to go through the Society of Advocates in Edinburgh. Right? I need to have you back up my courtroom. Right? Now, what you're missing your visit to Melrose. Melrose is the centre of the universe. Right, so this is the drawing room, and you can see it's much more feminine than the other rooms that you've seen. First thing you notice, obviously, is the Chinese wallpaper, either that or a huge portrait of Walter Scott there with his dog. Story behind the wallpaper, it was a gift from his cousin Hugh Scott, who was working with the East India Company. And he arrived at the border in China, and the Chinese said, you can't take this out, this is artisan work. But he said, but it's for my cousin, Walter Scott, the writer. And they said, well, fair enough. By this time, we're talking about 1820, 1821, Scott was really well known all over the world. Right? His books had been translated. The only place they weren't popular was Spain. They were forbidden in Spain until about 1840, 1845. Why? Because Scott was very Protestant. Right? And there were scenes in some of his books which do not do much good for the Roman Catholics. Right?
Let me guess.
You come right in.
Sharp things.
Are you feeling? So once again, you see the influence of Melrose Abbey. The grotesques round the wall. Some are copies from the Abbey, and some are from an old church that was demolished in Edinburgh, St Mary's Cathedral Church, where Waverley Station is now. But these are copies. We say that this is at the dentist, and that was how you feel when you come out. In that corner there. Now the ones that are of interest here, these two pistols belong to Scott. Now why did he need two pistols? Well, in the 1812s, 13s, 40s, this was an era of Napoleonic wars. And we were frightened, the British were frightened that Napoleon would invade. So all in the little towns all around the coast of Britain, there were militias. And Scott was the captain of a militia in Edinburgh. And so he was able to have these pistols. He had a uniform, and he says some of his happiest days were with his men on the beach in Edinburgh practicing. So those are it. When he went to Paris, to France after the Battle of Waterloo, he went to Paris where he met the great and the good. Wellington, or the Germans, the Russian Tsar and everything. He went there and he wore his uniform. Right? I told you he liked to show off a bit. Huh? The story goes that the Tsar of Russia came up to him and said, and you, with the battles, did you fight him? So of course Scott on the spot there, but being a man of fiction, he just made up a couple of Scottish towns and said that he fought in these battles, and the Tsar went away quite happy. This is the dining room, and you can see that it's much lighter than the other room, and this is because one of your compatriots married the last male descendant of the family, so Major General James Maxwell Scott. It was his second wife. She came to live over here. She was an American heiress. She had plenty of money. And she found everything just a little on the dark side. It sounds a bit like Star Wars, that doesn't it? She found things looking dark. So she had this painted cream and the woodwork changed. It would have been a dark maroon, a very good colour for a dining room. Again, the ceiling, same idea as in the library. You'll see there's a cabbage up there. Now, nobody really knows why there's a cabbage up there, but the little story goes that, and I'll test your French here, because after all I was a French teacher. He was in here with his wife Charlotte, who was French. And he was telling her, he said, Charlotte, my brain is like a cabbage. On each leaf there's different information pushed in, like a computer. And she turned to him and said, ah, mon petit chou. Mon petit chou in French means my little sweetheart. That's what you say to children, right? It's in this room that Scott died. He hadn't been well. He had had a few minor strokes, and the king and his friends, now the king, the relationship with the king is important, but the king organised a frigate of the navy to take him to the Mediterranean. He ended up at Malta, wasn't very happy there. Went to Naples where he met his second son, Charles, who was a diplomat. That's all we really know about Charles, apart from the fact that he liked hunting and was a good shot. And that's thanks to Washington Irving in his description of his visit here. While he was there, he received a letter from Goethe, the German poet's family, telling him that Goethe had died. He had hoped to visit Goethe on his way home. They had corresponded. But, so Scott is said to have said, how fortunate is Goethe to have died in his own home. I must get back to Abbotsford. So they took him back to Abbotsford, a journey of 2 months it took, up via Frankfurt and across and then up this coast. But he was too weak to climb upstairs to his rooms, so they brought his bed down here. A few days before his death, the story again goes, I tell you a lot of stories here, but he asked Anne to bring him a pen and paper. He would like to write something down. However, the pen fell from his hand to the floor, and they say tears rolled down his cheek. And he died a few days later. He was 61. Not a bad age for that time. but nevertheless, he had suffered quite a lot in the end. Straight down the corridor. That's his courthouse. It's still there.
A little bit of the outlaw. Oh my. Look at it. So, yes, sir.
Come right in, because you need to sit down here. This is your last Google.
Last Google.
Is your last Google chance now?
Try to move out. Somebody else.
Okay? You need to remember to talk about these two pictures here. This picture here, where there's a young man standing on the left with a monk, and in the big chair is an older man, Sir Gideon Murray, the King's Treasurer, Lord Murray. Right? Now Lord Murray has caught this young man. This young man is Willie Scott of Harden. Scott of Harden with the Millwrights. Right? Willie Scott of Harden, an ancestor of Walter Scott. And he has been caught on Lord Murray's land, just down the river, down here, up to no good. Now Lord Murray has a problem, and the problem is sitting next to him, his daughter. His daughter, she is so ugly, he cannot find a husband for her. She was known as Muckle-mouthed Meg. That's what you Google, Muckle-mouthed Meg, right? But Lord Murray has a brainwave, so he turns to Scott and says, I've caught you on my land up to no good, you now have two choices. I can hang you, or you can marry my daughter. Willie Scott looked at Meg and said no. And Sir Walter writes that only when he felt the cord tightening round his neck on the stout oak branch did he say yes. They must have been very happy to have 9 children. And had they not, there would have been no Walter Scott.
Wow.
So the story is a nice wee story. The next one, they're all done by the same artist, a friend of Scott.
Oh, that's beautiful. Can you take a picture?
Absolutely.
Same thing. It's beautiful. I love Harden anyway.
I'm going to take a couple because sometimes I'm not so good at this. There you go. So hopefully one of those will work for you. All right. I'm going. Oh, and this is where he was talking about where they came in. Remember?
Oh,
He
yeah.
said that
Yep.
for the deliveries.
Oh, that's good.
Good. Oh, yeah? You brought a fancy camera.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wish it came with a fancy battery. It dies too quick.
Oh, you taking a picture?
I got it without the cherry.
Oh, turn around. Oh, I don't know her name. Here, stand right there.
You can see where there was a
Got it.
the difference.
You don't need to pay me
Fourth
much.
arch along. There were steps and the path came along here and up through here.
Later, see you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will.
And this,
You see these two faces. You've got the Greek god on one side, but on the other side is very modern, young-looking face. That's a face of his seedsman. Right? His seedsman, Ormiston. And whether you know, I don't know whether you're going to place to walk around. Ormiston's shop was still there till about 15 years ago.
So is that what we're talking about, the things like the